The rediscovery of the banjo's roots soon led historians to look for gourd banjos made and played by slaves. Only two were known to exist in museums in Europe. So, beginning in the 1980s, with Dena Epstein's work to guide them, a handful of musicians set out to recreate early banjos. One of the first was Clarke Buehling.
First homemade banjo was a wooden salad bowl with a pine shelf plank. And one of the first skins I used was, somebody read somewhere about a pig bladder. I went to a slaughterhouse and got a pig bladder, smell. I don't think they even rinsed it out. And I went home and was peeling the muscle tissue off of this very thin membrane. I was going to use this membrane. I don't think the thing ever did smell good.
And the idea of making a banjo, a gourd banjo, why did you want to do that?
I wanted to hear what they sounded like. I was fascinated by that famous painting, The Old Plantation, the dancers and the gourd banjo.
Around 1984, Buehling met Scott Didlake, a banjo player from Mississippi, and recommended Dena's book.
I don't know anything about black slate banjo music, and I've been curious to find out, but as far as I know, there's no recordings of history of slate music.
Didlake devoured the book and soon wrote to Dena, describing his first attempt inspired by the Stedman banjo. In the making, he wrote, I often had the feeling of black and unknown hands guiding my work. He was repeating Dena's book dedication from James Weldon Johnson. As far as I know, Scott went on, nobody else has ever built such an instrument in 2 centuries. Scott Didlake and Dena Epstein corresponded for years. Mrs. Epstein spread word of his work to museums and musicians, and his customers included Seeger and Tony Trischka.
He was selling them for $250, and I thought, that's way too cheap. I'll give you $300. It's one of the very few times in my life I overpaid on purpose for something. No, you need to at least get $300 and more than that, but I'll give you $300.
Scott's most famous customer was John Hartford, shown here at his home with Scott and his new gourd banjo. Scott's letters to Dena were filled with a philosophy that growing the right gourds, which he did with the help of the Mississippi Extension Service, and making banjos was not a primitive art. As he worked, he felt the spirits of slaves. Many times, he wrote in 1992, I would just sit and weep over what they endured and what they gave us in spite of it all. To me, the instruments were more than a technology. They were a well of souls. You could hear the voice of those souls, those ghosts, in the instruments I was trying to make. From the very first one I made, the Stedman, I could hear that voice. That voice is what always drove me on in this. It was like the sound of Africans in the cargo hold of slave ships, and I wanted to discover the way to free it, bring it out, let it sing. Later that year, Scott and Dena finally met at the Tennessee Banjo Institute, where Scott, Clarke Buehling, and Seeger put on a gourd banjo workshop.
It was from that area of Africa that the first Africans were kidnapped into slavery in the New World. People like the Dogon, who were used as navigators on the slave ships. And they went after musicians intentionally to capture them so that they could be forced to play and force the people on the ships to dance so that they wouldn't die of atrophy on the middle passage to the New World. So there's a lot of heart-rending stuff associated with banjos to me. They're very haunting. What Mike was saying...
Are you saying that they played banjo music on those ships?
On the ships. Dena Epstein found this out. They would try to capture musicians with their instruments so that they were having so many people die of atrophy, they would force them under threat of the whip to play and force the people to dance.
In March 1994, Scott Didlake was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. By chance, Pete Ross, who had made gourd banjo reproductions while at the prestigious School of Visual Arts in New York, stopped in Jackson, Mississippi. Clarke Buehling told him to call Scott.
By the time I met him, he was pretty far along in his illness.
You moved there to be his apprentice.
Yeah, so the whole 2 days I was visiting Jackson, I stayed at Scott's house, and he started basically walking me through the process. His friend Richard, that second day, followed me out of the four-square apartment, and said to me, Scott had been looking for an apprentice to really teach before he died, and it was getting so far along he'd given up on this search, but now he had met me and decided I was the guy. We want you to stay. And I said, my girlfriend's got another semester, and it was pretty sudden and pretty intense to hear that then. So I moved back to New York, or I just went back to New York. I already had an apartment there, and sort of talked at length with Scott every night on the phone for maybe another month or two. And one of those days he was so sick, I realized, all right, this could happen at any time. He could go, So I said, all right, I'm coming down. We got to do this. And left New York, moved on to the couch.
What did you learn from him? I mean, you had made a few banjos. But
Scott really refined the way I worked. I mean, working with the gourds can get pretty complicated, I now work with Kevin Enoch doing wooden rim, sort of old-timey banjos, as well as the gourd banjos I do in my own shop. And I realized once I'd worked with Kevin for a while that a wooden rim banjo, a simple wooden rim banjo, is far easier to make than a gourd banjo. There's there's all sorts of unpredictable geometry in a gourd, and Scott gave me a systematic way for sort of working with that.
Did he also pass on some of his philosophy, which he would put into long letters, that kind of thing?
Well, he may have, but I think I've probably completely assimilated it at this point. So, one of the reasons he took me on as an apprentice is I think there was some like-mindedness there as well. He brought to his banjo making sort of like the highest sense of respect for these people. He came with the assumption that their culture was so important with them that they would treat every step of the process with care and consideration. And I still have that today, you don't fool around with these. I don't crank out something I can crank out, in a day and a half just because I can do it, sell it to a guy, and move on to the next one. It's like, it's got to be right.
Scott died in October of 1994.
One of his totems that he had with him at the end was the reproduction of the Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences. That's in her book. That's the close-up of the guy and the kid, and the guy's playing an early banjo. He had those guys with him. That was one of the things that brought him comfort. That was a totem to him.